When we hear people talk about rogue states, people like Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak and or others, what are they talking about when they're talking about rogue states?
Yeah, well, actually the book begins by pointing out that like most terms of political discourse, this term, rogue states, has two meanings. And that's true of most terms like, peace process or terrorism, or pick it as you like. One meaning is the literal meaning. Like, if you were writing a dictionary, what would it mean? The other is the operative meaning. That is the meaning that's used by the powerful as a weapon of propaganda. And those two meanings are typically quite different. So in the literal meaning, a rogue state would be a state that defies international norms, that is willing to use violence and repression in its own interests, state interests, independent, or the interests of, its domestic power, independent of either international law or what others want, and so on. That would be a rogue state. In the operative meaning, a rogue state means anybody who's not paying attention to the United States.
Madeleine Albright labeled Serbia's former president, Slobodan Milosevic, the next Hitler and opposed his nationalist policies and rhetoric. But the new president of Serbia, Kostunica, is as much a nationalist as Slobodan Milosevic was. What's the difference?
His position is very clear. He bitterly condemned the NATO bombing. He has denounced the International Tribunal on Yugoslavia as just an instrument of U.S. power. He's denounced the sanctions, and he represents probably a considerable majority of the population of Serbia, and it was a very impressive popular revolution. I mean, I think it was pretty dramatic. It showed people standing up against a repressive regime and replacing it. But if you look at what the people involved, and it was done by the people of Yugoslavia. One of them was quoted on the BBC the other day as saying, a student, we'll do it ourselves. Take your bomb somewhere else. Basically that. And that's the attitude behind it. There's nothing for Clinton and Albright to gloat about. They probably made this harder to achieve.
Well, there are a lot of people who are actually saying that there was a groundswell of opposition to Slobodan Milosevic, and in fact, the NATO bombing set it back by...
They reinforced him, yeah. In fact, suppose you started somebody bombed the United States. Well, you rally around the leader, no matter if you hated him. And that happened, just as it's happened in Iraq. Milosevic almost got, he was running a repressive state, but it wasn't a totalitarian state. In fact, he was overthrown in an election, and the popular aftermath to the attempt to undermine it. But that's happened before. I mean, in 1992, early in his career as running Serbia, there was an election. And the chances are that he would have been thrown out right then if the Albanian population had voted. The Albanian population of Kosovo boycotted the election. The reason was they preferred Milosevic, just as they preferred Milosevic in the current election. They had their own reasons. They figured if Serbia can be, the worse Serbia looks, the better their chances are. So they preferred Serbia to be run by the worst possible person. And that million or so votes, it would probably have been enough to, almost certainly have been enough to oust Milosevic right then. Again, in 1996, there were local elections in which the opposition made an extremely strong showing. In fact, took most of the major towns. And in reaction to that, Milosevic tried to undermine it, but there was a tremendous popular uprising, hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating for a long time. And it could have overthrown him right at the time, except that the opposition fractured and broke up, for internal reasons, which could happen again, incidentally. That's a very complicated opposition.
There seems to be a lot of support for Kostunica coming out of Washington. And I guess the question...
I'd be cautious about that. They are worried about him because they know perfectly well that, they can read his positions just as well as you and I can.
Right.
And they know that he's, as I said, he a part of his appeal to the population was that he presented himself, accurately as honest, not corrupt, not part of the whole corrupt repressive apparatus, but a Serb nationalist who is bitterly opposed to the NATO attack, to everything that Clinton stands for, and to the. He said that he would not release indicted war criminals to a fake tribunal. That's not exactly what Clinton wants to hear.
Professor Chomsky talks about U.S. involvement with Slobodan Milosevic and his regime.
The U.S., after all, made a deal with Milosevic back in 1995, a deal in which they completely sold out the Albanian Kosovars, who weren't even, Rugova, their main leader, wasn't even invited to the conference. And at that time, they were, there were two pretty. In fact, a number of pretty rotten characters in that region. There's not much to choose between Tudjman, who was the first Croatian president, and Milosevic. They're two peas in a pod, and jointly responsible for a lot of what happened. After that, when the U.S. did make the decision, sort of probably late 1998, to move on to bombing. That was primarily a U.S. initiative. Then started the demonization of Milosevic, and it sort of peaked in March 1999 when the bombing started. When you're bombing somebody, you demonize them. But it was interesting the way that shifted. Originally, the military tactics, it was claimed at least, were aimed at the Serb military. And at that point, Milosevic was demonized. But pretty soon the bombing shifted to the civilian society. So like power plants and, water stations and bridges and things like that, which is, of course, war crimes if anybody cares. As the bombing shifted to the civilian society, the propaganda shifted. And you can see it very clearly through April and May. It was not demonizing Milosevic, but demonizing the Serbs. So the Serbs were, Milosevic's willing executioners, and Serbia has to be cleansed and, occupied and purified like Nazi Germany and so on. There was a very striking shift in propaganda, which trailed along right behind the tactic of attacking the civilian society. And there's a general principle for propagandists. Anybody who you're attacking, you have to demonize. When you're attacking some structure that can be identified with Milosevic, demonize him. When you're attacking the civilian society, demonize the civilians.
We're talking with Professor Noam Chomsky, author of the book Among Many Rogue States. Professor Chomsky, let me ask you this question, because much of the justification that is used when the United States and or other powerful countries engage in the types of activities that they did in bombing Yugoslavia. I'd also like to talk about Colombia and perhaps the Middle East as well, but they often use the issue of so-called international law. But one of the things that you've been very good at showing is that while the U.S. purports to support international law, they're actually one of its biggest lawbreakers, if you will.
Oh, yeah. In fact, the U.S. has almost public contempt for international law. Look, nobody observes international law if they're not forced to. So the level of hypocrisy on this is quite astonishing. But the U.S. is a little unusual in its overt rejection of international law and international obligations. Look, the U.S. is the only major country that's flatly rejected a World Court decision condemning it for aggression. The U.S. was condemned by the court for what, in their words, unlawful use of force. That's terrorism or aggression in the war against Nicaragua, and the U.S. simply dismissed it. And in fact, had interesting reasons. It's kind of intriguing that those reasons have been, although they're public, they have, virtually nobody hears them. but they weren't publicized, and they're quite interesting reasons. The official reason given by the State Department in rejecting the World Court decision was the world does not agree with us on most issues of great importance, and therefore we must take it on ourselves to decide for ourselves what is an issue that falls within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States. In this case, what fell within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States was the attack against Nicaragua that the court had condemned as unlawful use of force. But since the rest of the world doesn't agree with us, well, we just can't go along with them. You couldn't get a clearer definition of a rogue state.
That's a great rationalization. People don't like it, and because they don't like it, we have to decide we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, because we want to do it, and if we can get them to go along with us, fine. If they won't go along with us, well, that just proves that we have to do it against the decision of the World Court in this case. I mean, like I said, you couldn't have a clearer definition of rogue state.
Professor Chomsky, can I ask you to turn your eyes for a moment to what's happening in Palestine and Israel currently?
What's happening is pretty awful, and it might well turn into something much worse. But if we want to understand it, we have to look at a little bit of recent history, which is uncontroversial but also undiscussed and very crucial. The settlement, what's called the peace process in the United States, is a settlement that has been instituted by U.S. Israeli power in isolation from the rest of the world. The U.S. has been in complete international isolation on this for since almost 30 years on the form of a political settlement in the region. And the position that the United States has taken, which is Israel's as well, is that the final settlement, the permanent settlement, the long-term settlement, does not include any meaningful recognition of Palestinian rights. There's a lot of talk about Jerusalem and the religious sites, and that's important. But there's much less talk about the much more important question of what the territorial arrangements are going to be. There is what's called a final status arrangement. That's been inherent in the Oslo process since the beginning. And what it means is that Israel will take over the territories and resources of the usable, valuable territories and resources of the occupied territories, and it will leave a local administration of Arab population concentration to the Palestinians. So it's kind of as if New York State said, okay, we'll give up Harlem, and let it be run by, local blacks, and we'll keep everything that's valuable in New York. In fact, it's very much like the South African homelands policy back in the early 60s, so-called Bantustans, which also carved out various regions which were to be under black control and were under black control, and provided a cheap workforce and some resources for the white-run community. That's exactly the way this thing is set up. If you take a look at the maps that were proposed as the final status maps, they break up the what's to be left of the Palestinians into 4 or 5 separate cantons, which barely have any connection between them. And this is intended to grant Israel the domination of everything it wants in the occupied territories. Now, the United States has been alone in supporting that for about 30 years, since. Give the details if you like, but that's what really lies behind it. And of course, as that system is implemented, it naturally leads to resentment, frustration, anger on the parts of the people who are being subjected to it. And as soon as something, you throw a little, drop a lighted match into this potential, collection of oil, it's going to blow up. That's what happened when Ariel Sharon who's a symbol of atrocities. I mean, his own career as a terrible career as a terrorist goes back to the early 1950s when he was involved in significant massacres, and they know it. When he goes into the Haram al-Sharif, the holiest site, with 1,000 heavily armed soldiers, he knows exactly what's going to happen, and it did happen. That's what set off the current battles that are going on, which are in which the victims are almost all Palestinians, of course. And it may escalate much further. But to focus just on the local situation is so ugly that it's hard to take your mind off it. It's really horrifying. Could get a lot worse. But we should understand where it's coming from and exactly what role we've had in it, which is substantial and is sure to lead to more and more conflict and death and suffering of exactly this kind. It's built into the settlement.
When we have an issue where the UN condemns Israel for excessive force in this instance and the United States abstains, I mean, that's a pretty clear message to the rest of the world and the Palestinians.
And what's unusual about that vote is the U.S. didn't veto it. If you look over the record of vetoes at the United Nations Security Council since about the 1960s, the U.S. is far in the lead. I mean, not just on the Middle East, but on a whole range of issues.
We're talking with Professor Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky's current book is Rogue States. Professor Chomsky, let me ask you, because one of the issues that continues to go on is the issue of Cuba and the embargo. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's an interesting example of the notion rogue state. The United States began attacking Cuba over 40 years ago. Planes were bombing Cuba from Florida, which the CIA, U.S. intelligence claimed it couldn't discover from around October 1959. The U.S. then invaded Cuba. After the invasion was beaten back, it imposed a very harsh embargo, which still remains. In fact, it's gotten harsher, much harsher since Russia left. For a long time, the claim was, well, they're an outpost of the Soviet Union. But as soon as the Soviet Union disappeared, the embargo got much, much harsher, which tells you how much validity there was to that claim. The U.S. has carried out terrorist operations against Cuba since the Kennedy administration, Operation Mongoose, which then continued for many years. In fact, Cuba was probably one of the main targets of international terrorism in the world. In the light of this relationship, the official story is that Cuba is a rogue state, not the United States. That shows how power really works, not only in the domain of real-world activities, but also in the domain of doctrine and propaganda. Cuba is a rogue state because it refuses to bow to U.S. power. And besides, there's fear of Cuba. There's fear of its, not that it's going to invade anybody, it's not going to invade Florida, but it does present a model of social and economic development which has a lot of appeal among the poor majority of the world. The former non-aligned countries, now they're called G77. It's the 133 countries roughly who account for about 80% of the world's population. They had their highest level meeting ever, level of heads of state, last April, and it was in Havana. And I think the choice was not accidental. It's an expression of solidarity. They were they came out with an extremely interesting declaration, which wasn't reported here. But it's the Cuban. There's a lot of things wrong with Cuba. Plenty of criticisms you can make about the Castro regime, very harsh criticisms. But that's not what bothers the United States. What bothers the U.S. government is not what's wrong with them, but what's right with them. And they don't want that model to exist, especially the model of non-obedience. Actually, to some extent, the same was true in Serbia. They were not obedient. In fact, if you like, the same is true of Saddam Hussein. I mean, as long as Saddam Hussein was just gassing his own citizens and torturing dissidents and so on, in fact, committing virtually all of his crimes, he was quite okay. He was a loyal, trusted ally, favored with grants and aid and military aid and so on. But when he disobeyed orders, he became, the beast of Baghdad. That's the crime that's not allowed.
When he was gassing the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq war, he was fine then. Right.
The massacre of Kurds with using chemical weapons against his own population. It's now held up to be, if you listen to Madeleine Albright or Tony Blair or whatever, as to why we have to maintain sanctions, the argument always is the same. I mean, look at this monster. He even descended to the ultimate crime, using chemical weapons against his own citizens, which he did, and all that's left out is with our support. That didn't make him an enemy. No, in fact, the Bush administration just continued to give him, to regard him as a friend and valued trading partner.
It's interesting that very little comes up about Turkey when there's ever a discussion about war on the Kurds.
Yeah, in fact, the most severe war against the Kurds has been in Turkey, and with enormous U.S. support. In fact, if you take a look at military aid to Turkey's, of course, always gotten a lot of military aid because of its strategic position and so on. But the military aid to Turkey increased very sharply in 1984, and it stayed very high right through the 90s. In fact, the peak year was 1997. And the reason had nothing to do with Russia. This time Russia was disappearing. That was exactly the period of Turkey's counterinsurgency war against its domestic Kurdish population, which involved, mainly under the Clinton administration, enormous violent ethnic cleansing, terror, torture, destruction, 3,500 villages destroyed, probably 2 or 3 million refugees. About 80% of the arms are coming from the United States in increasing flow as the terror increased. Actually, Turkey remained at the top of recipients of U.S. military aid. That's apart from Israel and Egypt, separate category. It remained at the top right through that period, through 1999, in fact, when it was replaced by Colombia. And the reason is that Turkey had by then pretty much crushed its domestic the domestic population, the Kurdish population, and Colombia had not yet crushed its own insurgency. So it moved into first place and is going up, in fact.
We're talking with Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, I wanted to get to Colombia because you addressed that in Rogue States. Can we talk about the situation in Colombia? It looks like it has the potential to be not only another example of U.S. imperialism in Latin America, but a tremendously bloody and dangerous one for all people concerned.
Yeah, and in fact, it already is. I mean, Colombia has had the Colombian government has had the worst human rights record in the hemisphere for the last 10 years or so, and has been the leading recipient of U.S. arms and training in the hemisphere, about half during the same period. They have a major insurgency underway. Its roots are deep in Colombian society. This is a potentially very rich country with an enormous discrepancy between a small sector of great wealth and an enormous impoverished population, which always carries with it the seeds of violence and insurgency, and it's been going on for a long time in Colombia. Got much worse in the last 10 years. By now, the annual death toll is over 3,000 political killings, about 300,000 new refugees generated every year. By now, it's about 2 million. It's one of the highest in the world. I think it's third highest right now of internal refugees after Sudan and Afghanistan. And it's getting worse. The atrocities are roughly on the order of 80% are attributed, where attributable, are attributed to the paramilitaries and the military, which is very much like Serbia and Indonesia and other places. Atrocities are farmed out to paramilitaries for the most part, and those are State Department figures, for example. They're not much contested. And those are the ones who are getting the aid and training. The pretext for all of this is a drug war, but that's extremely hard to take seriously. I mean, if the government is interested in dealing with the drug problem, first of all, they have no right to deal with it in this way. any more than China has a right to bomb North Carolina if they don't like tobacco, which is killing millions of Chinese. The problem is here. And if they want to deal with the problem seriously, they know perfectly well that the way to deal with it is not by bombing Colombian peasants. It's by offering treatment and education to people who need it here. There's no controversy over the fact that that's far more cost-effective as well as far more humane if you want to deal with the drug problem. If you don't want to deal with it, but you want to cover for more counterinsurgency operations, well, okay, you got them.
Professor Noam Chomsky's newest book, Rogue States, is published by South End Press.